Thanks again to Julie, and thanks in advance to Anna for your comments that will be coming up. I'll be presenting today on an upcoming publication I'm currently working on entitled Polluted Histories, Clean Futures, Differing Scenarios for an Electronic Waste Circular Economy in China. I will be covering the issue of electronic waste and a pollution alleviation method known as bioremediation within China's circular economy framework as a means to introduce a counter framework to the circular economy idea, one that challenges the circular economy model and its reconceptualization of pollution. So here's the outline of today's presentation. First, I'll be covering the issue of electronic waste in PRC China and how this issue fits in with China's environmental goals and challenges. This is followed by bioremediation, a method to sustainably clean up areas polluted by electronic waste. And then we use bioremediation as an example to discuss two epistemic approaches to China's sustainable paths of depollution. And finally, we'll have a conclusion with summary points. So to get straight into electronic waste or e-waste, I'm sure, as everyone is aware, China has had decades of appalling environmental regulation and detriment, and treatment of the environment due to a variety of factors. We can turn to the phenomenon of electronic waste for an illustration of this. So e-waste includes any kind of electrical or electronic equipment, from your refrigerator to your smartphone. Electronics and electronic wastes are made up of an assemblage of materials. Generally, e-waste is composed mainly of metals, plastics, and glass. And as shown in the pie chart at the top, the metal composition is high in copper, nickel, zinc, and lead, which are all heavy metals. Heavy metal pollution and toxicity from e-waste has occurred in China over many decades due to the illegal import of electronic waste from other more developed countries, as well as from a dismantling method known as informal recycling. These specific reasons for electronic waste pollution are subsumed under larger factors, such as the prioritization of economic development over environmental protection and lax environmental and business regulations and controls. This is despite the fact that China has ratified the Basel Convention, a global agreement to restrict and limit flows of electronic waste, and has attempted for many years to ban waste imports, finally achieving something close to success after 2017. So as regards informal recycling, this type of dismantling refers to crude manual forms of taking apart electronics and their components. For example, some methods, which are also detrimental to environmental and human health, include the open burning of wires to recover copper, acid stripping of circuit boards, chipping and melting of plastics, all in the absence of proper safety equipment or ventilation. Dismantling or dumping of e-waste materials has also occurred directly on or near open ground and waterways. Informal recycling was incredibly common at a large scale in China for decades, and although not always pollutive, some dismantling techniques in particular were, and the pollutive and toxic effects of this practice still linger on. Some of these photos here, for example, were taken about a decade ago, and since then China has introduced more regulations on waste and pollution management, imposed bans on the import of electronic waste, and has converted many informal recycling industries to more formal practices. But as you can see from the photo on the right, which was taken the last few years, some informal workshops and practices remain. Toxins coming from electronic waste include, for the most part, heavy metals like lead, copper, and chromium, as well as organic compounds, such as PCBs and PBDEs from flame retardant materials, as well as PAHs from non-fully combusted materials, as well as other organics that come from, for example, polymer-based plastics. Let's take a quick drink. In the last decade, really beginning in the mid-2000s, the CCP, the Chinese government, has taken greater legislative and structural action on waste and pollution management and alleviation at the national down to the local levels of government. The model of the circular economy, for instance, has been adopted by the government as a main development objective since 2006. The circular economy model is an ideal aim in current waste management practices because it has economic and environmental benefits. It saves on resources and raw materials that might eventually become waste by integrating them into a closed loop system. And it also cuts down on waste because potential waste materials are instead recycled and reused. Electronic waste, which is made up of valuable heavy metals and toxic materials, has been part of the circular economy developments idea from early on in the process. For example, the e-waste recycling town of Oyu, for example, was in 2005 designated as the country's first circular economy experimentation point. And the first national legislation in China integrating electronic waste with the circular economy was in the 2008 Circular Economy Promotion Law. Other steps toward the goal of the circular economy in electronic waste management include the establishment of eco-industrial parks, as well as waste import bans and the trialing of zero waste cities. These steps towards environmental sustainability have been driven by the recent change in the Chinese government's development agenda as a socialist market economy from essentially growth first, treatment second, to the increasingly official line of ecological civilization, or Shanghai Wenming. This developmental model places much more significance on environmental regulations and controls and sustainable development with Chinese characteristics. Despite these significant gains, China has many environmental challenges to deal with related to its years of economic development. For example, China has surpassed the US to be the biggest domestic generator of e-waste. This is due to many years of high GDP growth rates, which has translated to a tenfold increase in the middle class in just the past decade. This larger consumerist citizenry now has the disposable income to buy electronics, which also means an increase in domestic electronic waste. Domestic e-waste has nearly doubled in under 5 years from 7.2 million metric tons in 2016 to an estimated 15.5 million metric tons in 2020. Another environmental challenge particular to e-waste is the remaining pollution and polluted sites due to informal dismantling practices in the past. Soil pollution from e-waste and other industrial processes have a significant effect on China's environmental and economic development goals, with a recent study finding that at least 16% of land in China is contaminated beyond acceptable standards. Remediation of polluted land is a necessary step for China's sustainable environmental future, and this includes agricultural land for making food, as well as land for housing, as polluted soils have the potential to affect not just their immediate surroundings, but bioaccumulate in plant and animal matter and leach and migrate into waterways, groundwater, and buildings, which can have toxic effects on living species. So to get towards bioremediation, it is a method for remediating contaminated soils and has been trialed and researched on polluted land in China. Bioremediation uses a combination of plants and soil microbes, such as symbiotic arbuscular mycorrhizal fungi, long word, and bacteria such as rhizobacteria and types of degradative bacteria to remove toxicants like heavy metals and organic compounds from polluted areas. Plants and microbes remove toxicants using various processes such as degrading toxicants, moving toxicants from soils to plant roots and shoots through microbial pathways, and accumulating toxicants into their own plant or microbial cells. Bioremediation is argued to be less impactful on the soil, less expensive, and the most sustainable choice for soil remediation. Other remediation methods, for example, require soil to be manually moved off-site to be cleaned or permanently removed. and or require heavy machinery and resources. Bioremediation, on the other hand, is in situ, that is, it's done on site and relies mainly on underground processes of plants and microbes to break down and absorb pollutants. This more easily preserves soil productivity. Bioremediation is a method that has been used in China on e-waste sites, as well as on other areas affected by soil pollution, such as landfills, gasworks, mine tailings, and even agricultural land. Bioremediation is presented as a sustainable solution to anthropogenic soil pollution, such as from e-waste, but in what ways can it be framed as a sustainable approach to pollution? And what does this tell us about the conceptions of waste and pollution, environmental futures, and our relation to it? So we'll go into these questions in the next few slides. One framing of bioremediation is within the circular economy model. The circular economy, which we've gone into, but it follows the principles currently enacted to varying degrees and successes of reduce, reuse, and recycle, is within China's environmental and development agenda since the mid-2000s. It is therefore a normative mainstream goal, not just in China, but in many other countries, especially in the developed world. The environmental futures this paradigm entails are the closed loop of resources where there is limited or no waste because it is being reduced, reused, and recycled, and therefore limits or ideally allows no pollutants into the environment. This logic fits within conceptions of bioremediation, such as that bioremediation is a form of reduction, the reduction of pollutants, and therefore goes towards zero pollution goals. Bioremediation also is part of sustainable economic and social development agendas as put forth by government policy. In this sense, tackling soil pollution with methods such as bioremediation is part of the circular economy because it helps form a virtuous cycle in the ecosystem where pollutants are reduced and or cycled purposefully into pollution-tolerant plants and microbes, instead of leaching or bioaccumulating into other human and natural systems. However, a recent development in academic scholarship on waste and pollution in the fields of science and technology studies has taken up a different ontology of human relation to waste and pollution than the circular economy model. Referred to in various ways, but referred to here as short as possible as the permanent pollution approach. They all consider three main things. Firstly, that traditional approaches to toxicity are outdated in a world with complex, mixed, transformative, and novel pollutants, such as electronic waste and plastics. Secondly, because of this, many argue that we live in a world of ubiquitous pollution and waste that we no longer can be separate from. For example, human activity has introduced forever chemicals, microplastics, and other persistent bioaccumulative, as in they accumulate slowly in bodies over time, chemicals into the environment that now pervade human bodies as well. We exist in a state of entanglements with chemicals and toxicants. Thirdly, the approach notes that pollution needs to be linked with wider power structures, and that pollution does not exist in passive isolation, but is part of further relations with life forms and forms of life. Their environmental futures consist of this relation with diverse collectives, but within a world of persistent and pervasive chemicals. So if we conceive of bioremediation within the permanent pollution approach, this approach, unlike more traditional circular economy and toxicology approaches, points out the mixed, complex pollutants, such as those found in e-waste sites and tackled by bioremediation. For example, bioremediation has the possibility to remove multiple contaminants at a time, not just one in particular, but this process is complex and takes time, and as pointed out, likely cannot remove all possible toxicants. The permanent pollution approach also points to the embeddedness and implication of humans within waste and pollution. Bioremediation as a method gives more of the agency in pollution remediation to the action of plants and microbes, unlike other remediation methods that put more agency and emphasis on human-dependent action, such as the physical removal of soil. Handing over this agency also shifts human positionality regarding control of nature and becomes more of a relation of collaboration. This approach also actively connects these points of embeddedness to relations with power structures, such as government legislation on recycling, but also micro relations of power with non-humans, such as the significant role of plants and microbes in bioremediation. A permanent pollution approach shifts the ontological understanding of pollution and waste, as is typically perceived in a circular economy model, from zero waste, zero pollution goals to the perception that this will never be achievable due to the ubiquity of pollutants. These two perspectives have been used in relation to bioremediation to illustrate that bioremediation can be conceived of in these different ways. The permanent pollution approach shows that bioremediation is not just a simple cleanup operation using some plants and microbes, but has complexity, including with humans as implicated in its practices and processes. In this sense, bioremediation is not just a solution, but a relation to pollution. An ontology of permanent pollution acts to question and probe the idea of zero waste and zero pollution that is firmly within circular economy thinking. Thus, I think that proponents of the circular economy model in China should consider the legacies of chemical pollution and their complexity, as well as their ties to non-human systems such as soil ecology and plant and microbe relations in considerations of sustainable environmental futures. In that sense, I think that despite their oppositional stance on polluted futures, aspects of the permanent pollution approach can be useful for developing the circular economy model further. A circular economy that acknowledges the realities of chemical pollution can still adhere to principles of waste and pollution reduction while recognizing and building on the complexities of micro and macro level interaction. This would overall benefit and develop upon thinking around sustainability and what sustainable systems are. So in conclusion, although past waste may be embedded in the ground, the framing of its contemporary condition can preclude the future ideas it also becomes embedded in. The permanent pollution approach shows the potential a method like bioremediation possesses does not have to be limited by one particular framing. Acknowledging, integrating, or fully taking on the ideas presented in the permanent pollution approach can open up thinking regarding the circular economy and, by extension, sustainability. E-waste in China has been a significant issue in the modernization and development of the country as an economic and political superpower. China's economic and environmental development is certainly improving, but in what areas can there be more improvement and further recognition? E-waste and bioremediation currently have plenty of regulations, management, and controls in place for China's circular economy goals, but sustainable development requires further dynamic thinking. Thus, studying the histories and contemporaries of waste and pollution allows us to think of different progressive futures. Thank you.
So thank you so much. I have learned a lot from you. To be honest, even I'm in Alicia's committee, I have to learn a lot, and these are really new concepts for me. Perhaps we can start with Anna's comment. So Anna, how are you? Anna?
Yeah, I was looking for the unmute.
Yeah.
Thank you so much, Alicia. So I hope my scattered thoughts make sense. I really enjoyed the presentation, and I really enjoyed getting to know your work over the past couple of years. I think you're doing really exciting research. I think the ways in which you're using the topic to push the boundaries of some of the recent debates in social sciences and humanities about human and more than human has, a lot of potential, and it is really a good fit for the topic that you've chosen. So I guess my first set of comments is about the extent to which, as you say in your presentation as well, bioremediation has a potential to be understood as, part and parcel of China's efforts towards proving itself on the global stage as a modern, innovative, scientifically cutting-edge nation. And I wonder how much, you've said some of this already, but how much bioremediation plays a role in that discourse. Does it come at the center? Does it come in the background of, say, arguments for circular economy? And where it comes in those documents, how is the case made for it? I think would be interesting to explore. I appreciate so far that you've looked at, at least for the papers I've read, that you've looked at the scientists themselves. I think it might be interesting if there's scope to look at how official documents might make a case for it. And if it's not there very strongly, then it'd be an interesting question to consider there too. I know you didn't mention this word in the presentation, but I know it's in your written work, the ways in which there's a sort of mutual generation or symbiosis between, say, what's going on with bioremediation and the soil that it affects and the components of the soil that it's trying to affect. And part of me, maybe because I've been interested in the topic, I wondered to what extent that's similar or different to something like geoengineering, for instance. I know that's a completely, it's outside the scope of your work. I wouldn't suggest that you take that on fully, but it might just be an interesting thought exercise to think about how nature and how intervening in nature or nature intervening upon itself in a way may operate differently in these different kinds of interventions. Along similar lines, I really like your analysis of bioremediation as potentially moving away from a sort of an anthropocentric approach to intervention. But I also think both of them are going on at the same time with bioremediation. So there is potentially, scientists, experts, policymakers also empower themselves and sort of raised the their profile, if you like, by pushing some of these interventions at the same time as nature itself is empowered. And I think that ambivalent state of bioremediation could be really useful to explore in that balance, between is it anthropocentric, is it nature-centric? Should we really be splitting, which I know is not what you're doing. I also had a really ignorant empirical question, so bear with me with this one. I know there are loads of different types of bioremediation, but I know that some of them, for instance, the ones that are meant to tackle heavy metal pollution, are not so much about metabolizing it so it disappears, but they're about the crop effectively sucking up the pollution, and then you have to remove the crop, so that you're effectively displacing the contamination into another place. So I wonder how much, what could be said about that, and how it affects the ways in which bioremediation could be understood, construed by scientists, not as a permanent solution, but in a way, a displacement, which then would lead to the question of which places are okay to be contaminated and which ones are not okay to be contaminated, right? Related to that question, I had another empirical question about who decides which soil is worth bioremediating? How much power, say, do the scientists have in that? Who sets the standards for it? Is it about proximity to humans, proximity to livestock that might be affected by that contamination? What is it about? I will send you some confused notes as well at the end of this, so don't worry if you're not catching it all. I hope it makes sense.
Yes, it does. Yes.
What else did I have here? So I've said this already in some way, but I want to return to this point of bioremediation potentially being a technological fix, and the extent to which it might effectively serve to divert attention from, towards China's innovation capacity, its technological skills, and away from the root causes of the pollution. And in the case of e-waste, I guess there are two root causes we could think about. One is about the production of e-waste rather than looking at the end of life part. planned obsolescence, which I know you mention in your work, whether anything is being done within the parameters of circular economy, ecological civilization to tackle that, as well as promote bioremediation, or does it effectively become a kind of plaster that allows those practices to continue, or to continue a bit less disturbed than they might otherwise be? So the first is production. The second would be predictably consumption. We know that China dealt really well with the economic crisis in 2008 because it encouraged everyone to consume, and there were lots of conjunctions that came together and made that possible. But that encouragement to consume clearly leads to an unsustainable outcome in the end. So is there much discussion of a reduction to consumption as part of reducing pollution caused by things like e-waste? So effectively what I'm saying is, alongside bioremediation, are these two other potential deeper fixes to sustainability also discussed, or does it become a way of effectively ignoring them? I'm almost done, I think. Sorry, I'm just scrolling through my notes. I really like the points that you made at the end about permanent pollution and circular economy as well. I think there's a lot of productive discussion to be had there. And to me, I'm in many ways undecided about what the relationship between those two is. Is permanent pollution, does it become part of the circular economy model, in the sense that it makes it acceptable that some pollution is permanent and you basically make it part of the cycle? Or is circular economy as a concept undermined by the fact that some pollutants are permanent? Does that make sense as a question? So I want to there because I don't want to throw too much at you, and I want to hear other questions as well. But really fascinating work, and a lot of theoretical and empirical potential to explore. So thank you again.
Thank you. I think, Alicia, you have to select some to answer. Unfortunately, we have time limit. Please do.
Okay. Well, there were many things you brought up on. Thank you again for feeling under the weather. You had very good comments, I think. Yeah, a lot of your comments. These are also things I've thought about and wondered, and are things I'm also working through at the moment. For example, if the last comment, like, does permanent pollution become part of the circular economy model, or is permanent pollution undermining the circular economy model? Yeah, that's something I'm trying to deal with. I'm sort of when I'm writing, I'm trying to integrate it a bit more with the circular economy model. It was just a tack I took for the arguments, and because I wanted to kind of I didn't really get to it in this presentation, but I wanted to kind of engage with the idea of ecological civilization and how that's playing out in China, and if the kind of playing with the idea, does the permanent pollution concept, does it fit at all with the ecological civilization idea of development? So yeah, but that's a long thought there. I won't go there, but something I'm thinking about. Let's see. I don't know, just really good comments. Many things I'm thinking about, like with geoengineering. I also have thought many times of, will bioremediation, will it be co-opted in a sense and become some sort of technological fix, technological innovation that will solve everything, like geoengineering is sort of couched as, but is also, but I guess unlike geoengineering, I still feel like bioremediation has like genuinely very sustainable elements to it, and also really strong elements of like what I was talking about, like this embeddedness of human and microbial, or human and non-human. So in terms of plants, microbes, and the pollutants of those having to work together to achieve some kind of solution of less pollution. Whereas geoengineering is more like very, very human-centric, and it's like action and implementation. Whereas with bioremediation, you really have to rely on the actions and the processes that exist with plants and microbes. So there's less human control in that sense, and I find that really fascinating and really interesting. And yeah, it goes towards these ideas of microbes are getting quite popular to think about these days, but it's still quite common to just think of them in terms of like the microbes, say in our guts, that influence our moods and hormones and things like that. But there's not so much thinking yet about microbes out there in nature that we still have some sort of relation with, for example, with bioremediation to get rid of human-made pollution. So yeah, maybe maybe that's my response for now. Yes.
I think maybe I will take one question from the audience, if there is any question. Yeah, I see one hand, Iris. Yeah, please go ahead. Could you briefly introduce yourself as well?
Yeah, hello, thank you very much I know there's not much time, so thanks a lot. My name is Iris Barway. I work at Shanghai University. Thanks to Victor also for organizing this. So quickly, I really enjoyed your paper, and you know, this idea of bioremediation and okay, I don't want to go into this. I like this very much. I wasn't sure exactly how you connected the two parts, because you really had the first part where you talked about the electronic waste in China, and then the more theoretical part as a second part. What I wonder about this is that what you showed about the electronic waste, and you seem to contrast that to different ideas of circular economy. To some extent, that is circular economy, because a lot of what you showed and a lot of what this waste management or non-management consists of is getting the metal out, as you said, you know, separating the metal from the plastic coating. So you get the pollution, the plastic pollution, or when it's burnt, the air pollution, because the metal is supposed to be recycled into the economy. So because there are already ideas of circular economy. So I think there is an inbuilt ambivalence, or maybe even absurdity in there, or paradoxical relation, which somehow I don't know where you're going with this, but I think, you know, somehow what the pictures you showed, or also the whole process, is the transformation of waste into raw materials, which is so central to a circular economy. So I wonder how, you know, when you talk about waste all the time, I think maybe isn't that missing part of the picture when we have to consider how does that actually work when you think circular economy? When does waste stop being waste, and when is it a new raw material that gets recycled, and what does not get recycled? And this takes me to bioremediation, because it sounds great, but I wonder, I mean, what do these plants or microbes actually take up? And I know nothing about this, but my immediate hunch would be, you know, since plastic is actually the pollution problem because the metals get reused, is it because plastic are actually carbons that the microbes can use them? If that is so, could you elaborate on that? If that is not so, how does that actually work? I mean, it sounds a bit like a magic box. You put the microbes in there and then they clean everything up, but usually, you know, it doesn't work like that. So if you could say anything in the little time. And as a third point, you know, you portrayed this as illegal imports. I wonder about that, because to the best of my knowledge, which is very limited, so you definitely know more about this, but from what I've read, these were just, official imports in order to get cheap metal for the rising economy. And, to have this going on for decades, as you say, without the government noticing is somehow inconceivable to me, as far as I know. I mean, I live in China, so somehow that doesn't make sense to me. So I think that, my understanding was, maybe I'm wrong, that this was just, it wasn't called part of circular economy. That is just what happens when there is a poor country. Adam Minter talks about that. This you see this in many countries and rising economies, that one of the first things they do is they import other people's waste and use that as resources. The US did the same thing. So sorry, I'll keep it here.
Okay, many questions in one. Well, at least with your point about is this mining of e-waste resources, is it already circular economy? And also the idea of waste versus raw materials. Yes, I agree with you. These things have been brought up already, for example, by Lora-Wainwright, who's here, and also Yvonne Schultz. I know you've written a paper on multiple papers on the circular economy and kind of questioning this idea of the circular economy as well. So I maybe won't go into that too deeply right now, but I definitely recognize and acknowledge your points there. Maybe for how do the microbes and plants actually take up these toxicants? It's kind of complicated to say, but I can try my best in a short amount of time. There's multiple ways of going about it. For example, some toxicants, like some organic compounds, bacteria, enzymes, can break down those toxicants into less toxic forms, basically breaking up the chemical bonds, to say and ions as well. Well, yeah, I don't know if I can explain that any more simply in this amount of time. Also, yes, some are able to transfer chemicals or chemical elements, for example, heavy metals, into themselves. So yes, then they have to be harvested away sometimes. Sometimes they even, the bacteria, for example, they can shift the ion from a positive to a minus electron, and that can also shift the toxicant level, and also shift it so it can maybe be moved more easily out of the soil, because the idea is mainly getting it out of the soil, and ideally into a plant, at least for bioremediation. So when it goes into the plant, especially if the plant shoot, that's great, because then yes, the plant can be moved away out of sight and then be dealt with off-site. But nothing in the soils have been really disturbed or changed in that sense. Yeah, I hope I sort of answered that question. And I can see Julie.
we actually have to move on, but
okay.
It would be so great if Alicia can get in contact with Iris. Yes. And then I think we got a lot of questions that you can later work on. Yeah, thank you. And I have to move on to the next presenter. It's about science fiction, but in Chinese science fiction, they also talk about e-waste. So somehow we are connected. So the speaker is Eero Suoranta. He's a PhD candidate in the doctoral program in philosophy, arts, and society at the University of Helsinki. His research is focusing on alienation in contemporary Chinese science fiction literature. And I think today he wants to particularly explore one short story. So the floor is yours, Eero. Oh, and maybe I should also quickly, while you are sharing the screen, I can briefly introduce our discussant as well. It's Erik Mårweling from Uppsala University, Sweden, also doing his PhD, I think related to science fiction, and that's how we connect Eero and Erik. So, yeah.
Yeah, thank you very much for the introduction, Julie. Today my presentation will be on Han Song's 2014 science fiction short story, Submarines. But before I go into a discussion of the story itself, there are two terms I should briefly define. So the first term is alienation from nature, by which I refer to the idea of increased human disconnect from the natural world, commonly understood to be related to modern technology and way of life. As one specific example of this idea, I would like to mention the concept of nature deficit disorder, or NDD, coined in 2005 by Richard Loeb, a journalist and co-founder of the Children and Nature Network. So NDD was specifically meant to describe how children's lack of contact with nature leads to various psychological and physical problems, and how increased exposure to the natural world can in turn have beneficial effects on their development. However, as Elizabeth Dickinson has pointed out, nature deficit disorder as a discourse is problematic since, among other things, it evokes, quote, a fall recovery narrative that children are separated from nature and must return, end quote. According to Dickinson, such narratives can in turn, quote, reify the human nature split, obscure environmental justice, influence irresponsible behavior, and normalize contemporary conditions and relationships, end quote. In light of such criticism, we should therefore approach NDD and similar narratives of alienation from nature with a certain amount of skepticism. The other term I would like to define is the Anthropocene, proposed by Paul Crutzen and Eugene F. Stormer as the name for the current geological epoch, which is characterized by the ecological and geological impacts of various human activities. The exact starting date of the new epoch has been a matter of some debate, as has been the name Anthropocene or human era itself, with some scholars preferring terms like Capitalocene or Plantationocene that are more specific about the systemic causes of environmental degradation. For the moment, what I would like to focus on is the basic idea that humankind has transformed the natural world so thoroughly that we are now, in fact, a major geological force, as Crutzen and Stormer put it, which to my mind raises two questions. One, if the natural world is no longer natural in the sense of being untouched by human activities, can we in fact return to nature, as various fall recovery type narratives suggest we should? And two, since human beings are a part of nature, how have we, by transforming our environment, also transformed ourselves? Which brings me to the short story Submarines, written by Xinhua News Agency journalist and science fiction author Han Song, and first published in the magazine Southern People Weekly in 2014. My quotes are from the 2009 English translation by Ken Liu. So the story is told from the point of view of an adult, identified as male in the English version, but not as far as I can tell in the original, recalling their childhood in an unnamed Chinese city. As a child in elementary school, the protagonist likes to go to the banks of the Yangtze River to see the eponymous submarines, which are in fact, quote, so numerous that they look like a carpet of ants or thousands of wisps of rain-soaked clouds fallen from the heavens, end quote. These submarines, we are told, have been built by peasants who come to the cities to work and use them as mobile submersible homes. While the children of the city are fascinated by submarines, most of the adults, as well as media, seem to ignore these vessels and even reprimand the children for talking about them. The only exception are a few curious adults who gather to gaze at the subs and speculate that over time they might develop a new civilization. Later on, the narrator describes diving below the surface of the river with their friends, where they meet the children of the migrant workers swimming around in wooden cages, somehow able to stay underwater without any technological assistance. However, unable to find anything they might have in common with the migrants, the city children return to the surface, where they are summoned back home by anxious adults. The final section of the story describes a night when a fire of unknown origin spreads among the submarines, with seemingly the entire population of the city looking on. For some unknown reason, the subs do not simply dive underwater to escape from the flames, and neither do the city dwellers do anything in order to extinguish the fire. Instead, they seem to have gathered at the scene, quote, only to witness the death of alien creatures in the river, to watch as the uninvited guests achieve total freedom, end quote. The story ends with a brief description of the wreckage and how it is cleared away, with the final line being, after that, no submarines came to the Yangtze River, end quote. So the science fictional technique at play here is commonly known as estrangement, meaning making familiar things seem strange, as theorized by Darko Suvin. Here, however, I will draw primarily from Simon Spiegel, who goes against Suvin by arguing that on a formal level, science fiction, quote, does not estrange the familiar, but rather makes the strange familiar, end quote. Spiegel justifies this claim by breaking Suvin's estrangement down into three related but separate categories, which are, one, diegetic estrangement, or, quote, the collision of contradiction elements on the level of story, end quote, or when, quote, a marvelous element is introduced into a seemingly realistic world. This marvelous element is what Suvin refers to as a novel thing that does not exist in our world, but can exist in a science fictional universe. The second category is naturalization, defined by Spiegel as the process of normalizing the alien, or in other words, treating the novum, the marvelous thing, as if it were normal and plausible. And the third category is defamiliarization, or, quote, the formal rhetorical act of making the familiar strange, end quote, which is not meant to indicate that the world of the story is actually different from our own. According to Spiegel, this defamiliarization is relatively rare in science fiction, since it can interfere with the process of naturalization. To illustrate, here are some examples of these three aspects from Submarines. For diegetic estrangement, or marvelous elements that make the world of the story different from our own, we have the herds of homemade submarines themselves, as well as the potential sped-up evolution of the migrant workers. These marvelous elements are in turn naturalized in that their presence in the story is justified by depicting them as technological or scientific, and not, for example, as supernatural. Finally, the story does also make some use of defamiliarization, such as when the narrator refers to the stinking trash strewn across the surface of the river as, quote, an unforgettable, lovely sight, end quote. This is quite clearly an unusual descriptor that makes an otherwise ordinary image appear strange to the reader. However, such unusual descriptions also appear, for example, when the narrator compares the submarines to, quote, wisps of rain-soaked clouds, end quote, or, quote, a pack of hungry, silent wolves in the deep of winter, end quote. These are instances where the narration uses defamiliarizing language to refer to an element within the world of a story that is in itself, in Spiegel's terms, marvelous. Therefore, I argue that Submarines does not merely utilize the three forms estrangement, but also maintains an uneasy tension between them by alternatively naturalizing and defamiliarizing a central novum of the story, that is, the Submarines. This tension then creates an atmosphere that can perhaps best be described with the word eerie, guiyi in Chinese, the adjective used by Li Guangyi to characterize Han Song's literary style, which he sees as being rooted in indeterminacy. Notably, in Submarines, Han Song never commits to a singular explanation for either the origin of the submarines or the ability of the migrant children to stay underwater, preferring instead to answer the questions posed by the characters and by the readers with a sort of an authorial shrug. One possible reason that Submarines is able to use naturalization and defamiliarization in such a way is the cultural status of the eponymous vessels, which would normally not qualify as a novum in contemporary science fiction. After all, submarines very much exist in the real world as well. Arguably, the most famous submarine in the world comes from Jules Verne's novel 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea, which is mentioned by name in Han Song's story. In Chinese literature, there is also the submarine of Wu Jianren's 1908 work, New Story of the Stone, which was even equipped with silent electronic cannons. It is this particular vessel that Mingwei Song apparently refers to as one example of a novum that, quote, crystallizes utopianism in concrete images of a future that is advanced equally in science, morality, and political life, end quote, in late Qing Dynasty science fiction. Han Song's submarines, on the other hand, have far less impressive technical capabilities than real-life submersible vessels. Their novelty instead comes from their vast numbers and the fact that they have apparently been built by ordinary craftsmen and farmers. The idea of class division leading to the evolution of two separate human species is also not exactly new. A similar concept can be found, for example, in H.G. Wells' classic story, The Time Machine. What makes Submarines different from these early examples, however, is how it uses this conceit to comment on the Anthropocene. Noting that, quote, ecological destruction at times exceeds realism's expressive capabilities, end quote. Carl Healy has shown how Chen Qiufan's science fiction novel Waste Tide is nevertheless able to capture the enormity of ecological devastation. Similarly, Submarines uses estrangement in its various forms to highlight how humankind has transformed its environment and how this transformation affects us in turn. Instead of species like the baiji or the Chinese river dolphin, the Yangtze in Han Song's story is populated by the eponymous submarines, which are also described as replacements for the fields that the peasants used to call their home, now consumed by growing cities. Moreover, although the lifestyle of the submarine-dwelling migrant workers clearly resembles that of the boat people of southern China, their background also recalls the crisis faced by Pacific Island nations and the people of Asia's coastal regions, whose homes are threatened by rising seas. It is in this aspect that Submarines also brings to mind proposed alternatives to the term Anthropocene, such as the Capitalocene. While the city dwellers see the peasants as uninvited guests, they are in fact coming to the city to seek employment and therefore keeping the wheels of the urban economy turning, even though it was this economic system that displaced them in the first place. Through the fantastical scenario of divergence in the evolutionary paths of the city dwellers and the migrant workers, Submarines calls attention to the fact that the burden of adapting to environmental degradation is not evenly distributed, and that simplistic narratives of alienation from nature do not capture the complexity of our relationships with our transformed environment. To better illustrate how the story shows this complexity, I would like to draw your attention to this quote, where the leader of the kids from the city asks whether the rural peers have ever seen a car. Finally, a look of curiosity appeared on the face of one of the peasant children. A car? What's that? His voice was barely a whisper. I thought he looked like a creature out of manga. Ha! I knew it! Our leader sounded pleased. There are so many types of cars. Honda, Toyota, Ford, Buick. Oh, and also BMW and Mercedes. We don't know what you're talking about, said the peasant kid, his voice hesitant. But we've seen lots of fish. There's red carp, gold carp, black carp, sturgeon. Oh, and also white bream and amur bream. Now it was our turn to be nervous. We looked around, but didn't see any fish. Our teachers had taught us all fishes in the Yangtze had gone extinct. So were the peasant children trying to trick us? Where could they have seen fish? I hope they really evolved into different species from us, muttered our leader. End quote. In this scene, Han Song clearly juxtaposes the vastly different life experiences of the two groups of children, in a way that recalls Louvre's concept of nature deficit disorder. However, here the comparison is shown from the perspective of the city children, who find the knowledge of the so-called natural world displayed by the rural peers uncanny and disquieting. Moreover, that migrant children have only gained this knowledge because they are living in thoroughly polluted waters of the Yangtze. Yet at the same time, the role that technology, as symbolized by car brands, plays in the lives of the city's children makes it clear that both groups have been transformed by the Anthropocene. This further makes the idea of a return to nature seem like a pipe dream. Not only is there no natural place to return to, there are also no natural humans that could undertake such a return. However, the most relevant question for not only the previously quoted scene, but indeed for the whole story, is not whether the city dwellers are able to recognize different species of fish, but rather whether they are able to recognize the migrants as people. Here I would like to refer to Kara Healy's idea of gender hybridity between Western science fiction subgenres and modern Chinese realism, which she sees as one way of characterizing contemporary Chinese science fiction. In Submarines, this debt to Chinese realist literature manifests most clearly in the final passage of the story, where the callousness of the city dwellers recalls Lucian's famous description of an apathetic Chinese crowd watching an execution. These parallels reinforce the implication that the city dwellers are morally wrong in not recognizing the humanity of the migrants, however broadly that humanity would need to be defined to include this potential new species. In an interview with Chiara Ciccarini in 2014, Han Song talked about the role that aliens play in his works, saying that, quote, on one hand, it's like the Western world is the alien. On the other, it's we, the Chinese people, are the aliens. We're alienating ourselves from our hearts. In this sense, Chinese people are themselves becoming monsters. We're eating everything, the environment, our culture, our people, end quote. In my view, this quote also helps contextualize the otherwise arguably dehumanizing way that the migrants are portrayed in Submarines. While the narration very much emphasizes their eeriness and their differences from the protagonist, they are specifically noted as not being a threat to the city dwellers, who therefore have no justification for their fear and distrust of the migrants. In truth, it is the city dwellers who, in eating the fields of the peasants and not attempting to prevent their deaths, have compromised the ethical core of their humanity, which should matter more than any cultural or even biological differences between the two groups. Submarines is admittedly a pessimistic story, as is typical for Han Song. It offers no characters that the reader can easily root for, and its ambiguities also make it hard to discern any specific environmentalist or ethical message. Nevertheless, I propose that these features make the story into a useful avenue for what Dickinson calls inward expansion, which she argues is one necessary complement to Loeb's suggested practices for seeking reconnection with nature. According to Dickinson, quote, inward expansion calls on adults to address cultural, economic, and political systems that contribute to alienation, notably concerning issues that are missing from Loeb's conversation: poverty, racial segregation, cultural alienation, environmental racism, and rampant overconsumption. Love and educators call for children to be outside and active in nature places. I call on adults to first be reflective in our inner unknown spaces, perceiving the psyche and cultural practices as frontiers, end quote. I argue that with its airy indeterminacy, Submarines provides the reader with a way to grapple with these cultural practices. Instead of reproducing simplistic narratives about humanity's need to return to nature, Han Song's story questions the very categories of human and natural, highlighting that not only have we transformed our environment, but we have also been transformed in turn. Moreover, by addressing the unequal results of this transformation for two different groups in contemporary China, Submarines links environmental problems with economic and social relations, showing that not only do we need to address alienation from nature in our societies, but that we must also reject the dehumanization of those who suffer the most from environmental degradation. And here are more sources, so thank you very much.
Thank you, Eero. I wonder if Eric is ready to give comments.
Yes, I am.
Hi.
Hey. Well, yes. Well, thank you very much, Eero, for this really intriguing and thought-provoking presentation, I think. I do think that my impression is that you do really raise some really important and relevant questions, I think, that we should probably all think about, you know, in times like these. Can we really return to nature and so on? Is there a nature to return to and so on? I think this is a really, really intriguing question to me, and I think it's an important question. I mean, I think we can see a lot of these kinds of narratives everywhere. I mean, we could both historicize it and go back a long time back to, I don't know, the Romantics or whatever, or we can, I mean, even today in the environmentalist movement and so on, and also, I don't know, eating raw foods or whatever. I think this kind of narrative is very seductive to sort of, you know, going back to nature. It's a very, as you point out, a simplistic narrative that's sort of perhaps a bit escapist in some cases. So I think that you make a very good point that we should be skeptical of such narratives and their variations. I guess one thing that one could discuss is you know, sort of the equivalent of these kinds of discourses and narratives in China, of course. To what extent and what differs the sort of Chinese narratives from these more sort of Western, so to speak, narratives that I just mentioned. But I think you could probably find equivalent movements in China. At least that's my impression. So I think we've got a lot of stuff to develop there, it seems to me. And you connect this to the Anthropocene, which I think makes a lot of sense in your discussion. You could also connect it to other discussions, of course, of post-humanism and so on, as you're probably aware of. What seems to be going on to me, perhaps, is very much this sort of nature-culture dualism, right? Which is also something which is obviously very much related to the Anthropocene, but a related discussion. Yes, I also thought that you had a very good choice of a story here, actually, because I did read this story before, but because I also read a lot of Han Song, but it was not initially obvious to me, you know, that this story, to connect this story to these concepts that you were discussing, you know, you were just discussing. So I think that's very good that you could locate this really important discussion to something that I think wasn't that obvious actually in this story. It's a very good example. When reading, listening to you and rereading the story, another novel by Han Song that also came to mind. I don't know if if you've read it, Red Ocean, you know, 红色海洋, which is also, if you haven't read it, you might want to read it, of course, because it's also about ecological disasters and, you know, post-apocalyptic future, post-human species, and so on. It could be worth checking out if you want to find some Han Song texts that are related, of course. Yes, I have quite a lot to say here. I don't know if I'm speaking for too long, but I did like the way that you problematized the concept of estrangement, which I think is a very good thing to do, it seems to me, because my impression is that this concept is used a little bit uncritically sometimes in science fiction studies without really, it's just throwing it around, and you did develop it and problematize it, and I like that. And I think particularly this way that the case you make for this, if I understand you correctly, the way that these submarines are kind of, there's a kind of dialectic of sort of familiarization and defamiliarization, and then they're never entirely familiarized or defamiliarized, which I think is, you make a good case for that, and I think that's also a very interesting narrative strategy. So I really like that part. Towards the end of your talk, you also bring up this concept of genre hybridity, right? I think that kind of makes sense, particularly now, when I listen to it. But I wonder if it's really necessary to bring in this concept. I don't know, maybe it's just a suggestion. Maybe you can think about that. You already have a lot of good concepts, a lot of good stuff to work with. And I'm not sure if that concept is really necessary to discuss. It seems you want to use this concept to discuss the sort of just more socio-cultural aspects of the story, of the migrant workers and so on. But I'm not sure if you necessarily need another concept to do that. That could be something that you perhaps could think about. Yes. One suggestion I had, which you might want to look into or not, was I started thinking about this concept of the sublime, because I don't know what you thought about the ending, but when I reread the story, I thought very much about this concept of kind of a mix of natural imagery, and kind of this environmental degradation as well. Which almost like a sublime vision, but a very weird one. And I just thought that maybe that could lead to some interesting, discussions considering the sublime and its relationship to nature. And here we have this very strange sublime vision. If it's sublime, it's a very strange sublime vision of this beautiful scenery mixed with I don't know, thousands of cell phones or whatever it was. This garbage. So that could be perhaps something that you could look into. I like the when you talked about defamiliarization. I really like that, and like I said, I like the way that you divided the various forms of estrangement. And you briefly mentioned this sort of defamiliarization of language, right? And it just struck me that you could probably find more of that stuff actually in the story, sort of how it seemed to me that, and you also have some of those examples in your talk, how he kind of uses the kind of natural, and he makes this a natural and sort of technological language and imagery and sort of blends them together in a way that I find very interesting, and that kind of also precludes, the sort of construction of this kind of nature human or nature culture divide in a very interesting way. Just thought you could probably find more examples of that. You could develop that. You did mention it, but I think you could probably develop that. Yes, I don't know how much more time I have. I have a lot of stuff here.
Perhaps we don't have enough time. So yeah. I will encourage that you exchange emails later on, but now I would like to ask Eero to kind of select some questions to respond. Is it okay?
Yes, thank you very much, Eric, for all your comments. I haven't read Red Ocean, and to be honest, I need to read more Han Song. I have some of his stories I have read. I have several in my corpus, but I do I do plan on getting more of a grip of his works as a whole. As for post-humanism, yes, you're absolutely right. That was one of the things I was planning to talk about originally, but then it kind of, I decided that it's for this 15-20 minutes, it was a bit too much. I will try to go more into that in my thesis, and as well as into the genre hybridity, since it's actually since I'm dealing with primarily with social alienation, disconnect between the individual and the values of wider society, which is also something that appears very much in Lu Xun and in other early critical realist writers. So that's kind of one of the reasons why I brought it up here, since we will be discussing it more in my thesis. But you're right that it may not have been technically relevant for this paper in particular. And it is also Cara Healy's wonderful paper on Waste Tide talks very, very much about how the novel uses generic hybridity to bring out the enormity of environmental devastation. So that's also one of the influences on my thinking. I'm also glad you mentioned that you mentioned looking into equivalent narratives in China. This nature deficiency disorder was something that actually came up, but completely by chance when I was finishing the paper, and then I realized that actually, well, this is a very this is a useful example. This is something that people will recognize, but I want to show more specifically, what are the equivalent Chinese discourses on this matter. One thing that I did not mention in the paper, but that came up, or that came to mind when I was reading Dickinson's critique, is that according to her, within Richard Lowe's work and the similar discourses, there's often the phrase, when I was young, when I was a child, we used to climb trees and we used to play out in the woods and so on and so forth. And as you may recall, Han Sung's story starts in the English translation with the words as a boy, or in Chinese, xiao shu hou. So he uses the same, the very same construction, the very similar phrasing to introduce something, the narrator does as a child, technically out in the nature, but instead of playing in the woods, he's looking at these submarines, which I think is a very interesting, contrast and kind of like a subversion of that kind of discourse.
Thank you, Eero. Any questions from the audience? Perhaps only one. Well, I don't see hands here. I personally have one, but you don't have to answer if you feel this is kind of not your focus, because I'm thinking about the author himself, Han Sung. He's a state journalist, and how he juxtaposed himself with his role as a state journalist and covering this kind of topic. Maybe you can answer in 30 seconds. Yeah,
I mentioned that since it's something that always comes up with Han Sung, that he is he works for Xinhua as his day job. I don't know if he's a full-time author now, but at least for many years. And he has said that he has commented something along the lines that the stories he works on his day job as a journalist are more fantastic than anything he writes in science fiction, and which is, I'm sure if that is the case, I'm always a little hesitant to say that reality is more fantastic than sci-fi, but it is it kind of tells you something about where he's coming from, what his background is. And it's also interesting that Richard Lowe, who came up with the nature deficiency disorder thing, he's also a journalist. So these two men, both in the same field, in different countries, have kind of come to dissimilar conclusion, or have been grappling perhaps with same questions, but have come into different conclusions. So that's one of the reasons I wanted to mention that also.